Alrighty, next up, presenting Building a Sustainable Accessibility Practice. Everybody give it up for Devon Persing.
There we go. There we go. Am I on the thing? Yay. Hi, I don't have a code for you. I'm going to talk about feelings and having a conversation with your coworkers. I don't know why they let me in. So what I want to talk today is about ways that you can make accessible websites for your customers, users, in an actual sustainable way. So a lot of the burden of accessibility falls on developers because it's seen as a technical problem, which is problematic for a lot of reasons. But there are some things that you can do and some things you can do with your coworkers to make this a little bit more sustainable. So who does accessibility work of any sort? I would like to see a show of hands. Yay, more than like 3 people. Who, after the keynote this morning, wants to do accessibility work, who isn't currently? Yay, even more people. Okay, so for those of you that are doing accessibility work, are you the only person on your team that's responsible, quote unquote? How many hands? Just a couple. Okay, that's really good. I'm sorry for you people, but this might help you, and this will help other people too. Okay, so reasons why this falls on developers a lot is because usually when accessibility rears its head, it's seen as a thing you have to fix. It's a list of bugs, and the developers fix the bugs, and then it's fixed, it's great. But usually what happens is developers don't have time to do research or testing. They don't know exactly what they're supposed to be doing to fix issues. It usually gets tacked on at the end of a cycle. It's not part of the actual sprint. It's not part of the actual design process. It's not part of the product sort of conception process. So it ends up being this thing that, again, developers have to fix. You might be following specs and following best practices, but again, since you can't test, you don't know if what you're doing actually makes sense or not, or if it's actually usable by actual humans. And then sometimes developers get put in charge of accessibility, which doesn't make sense because developers don't like being in charge of things, and it doesn't make sense for you to drive an initiative that's not only a technical thing. So this doesn't make sense, it's not sustainable, it doesn't work. So congratulations, it's not your responsibility alone. However, that means that you do have to work with your coworkers to make this work. So this can be people that can design, people that do testing, product owners or PMs, anyone in leadership at your organization, including management, including C-level people, as well as anyone that does analysis. Everyone is responsible in some way. So the bad news is that you have to talk to these people about making this work and making this sustainable. Which again, sometimes developers don't like talking to other people, so that can be difficult. But here's some things that you can do. Things you can do yourself to sort of set the groundwork to make sure that you're making something that is going to be sustainable from a technical perspective is following best practices for standards, all the boring stuff, following the W3C standards, following the ARIA spec, all the things that you know you're supposed to do those things. Think about when you're using third-party applications or platforms or frameworks, anything you put in front of users, you're responsible for, and that stuff all has to be there as well. Do some testing. I'm going to list a few things you can do. You need to do some baseline testing just to make sure that what you're doing is going to be working for people. So as far as standards and progressive enhancement go, following specs supports assistive technologies because they follow those specs as well. So browsers and other user agents are all supposed to follow guidelines to make sure that all that information is exposed to users. So if you do that yourself, then you're going to make sure that that stuff's out there for users. As much as you can, use the simplest solution to solve your problem. You might be able to do it with some really complicated JavaScript. You also might be able to do it just with HTML. If you can just do it with HTML, do it with HTML. It's less work for you to maintain, and it's going to be more progressively useful for people. Create device-agnostic experiences. This might all seem like things you're supposed to do for mobile. Like, this is sort of general best practice stuff. This is all going to make your products more accessible for people. So create device-agnostic experiences. Don't assume that someone is or isn't on a touch device. Don't assume that they're on a desktop computer. Just don't assume. Make sure that your stuff is built so that anyone can access it from anywhere using any device. If you have a code library or a pattern library or any sort of internal best practices for how you write code, how you talk about code, how you vet code, contribute to those things. Make sure that you're not doing things as one-offs as much as possible. So I mentioned procurement, and usually you're thinking like, well, procurement's like buying, like, I don't know, like the billing package we use. It's also anything that you bring into your organization that you're then putting in front of users. So for folks that are building web applications, any sort of third-party code you use that you did not make, even if it's made by a vendor, you are now responsible for, and you have to make sure that that's not going to cause problems for users. So usually you can ask questions like, can I adapt this framework's output? Do I have any control over what code is actually getting spit out of this thing that I'm using? If you're working with a vendor, do they talk about accessibility at all when they talk about the code that they write? Are they following your guidelines? If you give them code recommendations, are they following those at all? As far as testing goes, there's a few things you can do that are very, very simple that will make sure that you're creating a baseline of accessibility. So validate your code. Again, super boring, but really important. Make sure you can use all of your applications with the keyboard. Everyone that's using some sort of AT is going to be using something that is like a mouse or like a keyboard, or one of those two. You want to make sure your DOM order makes sense across breakpoints and across your application. Any sort of media has a text equivalent. Make sure your forms have labels. Again, really basic stuff, really easy to not do, but really important. As much as you can, leverage automation. A lot of these things, you've seen multiple people have been talking about automated tools. Use automated tools to check things as much as possible. It saves you a lot of energy, and it's things that are better, computers are better at catching than humans are. So things you can't do by yourself, things that you do require other humans to help you with, are prioritizing accessibility within your team, within your organization, on the products you work on, creating accessible designs, unless you're also doing design work, and also testing everything you make with people with disabilities. So lucky for you, you aren't probably sitting by yourself in a room making web applications, although if you are, that's difficult, congratulations. But you have other people that work with on your team with you. You might have a larger organization if your team is bigger. You have the people in this room and the people on the internet who also are developers, and you have the people that actually use your application. So you can leverage all of these different groups to actually help you do this process. So the rest of this is a lot of questions you can ask people. So for example, if you've got stakeholders, leaders, analysts, people that are doing the sort of people level of the application, ask them about diversity and inclusion. Do we have a mission statement as an organization? Is that important? Is there a mandate for accessibility? If there's a legal mandate or any other mandate, it doesn't make sense for one person to be in charge of this. You need to have the whole team involved. How do project roadmaps get made or insert any sort of documentation at the product level? At what point do people decide what we're making? How do those things get documented and prioritized across teams? Often I'll work with really big orgs, and different product teams rarely talk to each other. They might have completely separate processes, which can have its strengths, but also means that there's a lot of duplication, and people who could benefit from speaking to each other aren't. How do you get and integrate feedback from users? Do you actually listen to users, or are you sort of working in a vacuum? If you're working with designers, are they thinking about color, proximity, and consistency in the visual presentation? Are they thinking about micro-interactions and workflows, especially for mobile and up, if you're going through a very small linear workflow? Are they thinking about those steps? Are they thinking about organization, language, structure, labeling, again, text equivalents for media? Is that stuff that the design team is actually thinking about and conveying to you when they're handing off the design for you to work on, or are they not? Do you get to talk to them before things get finalized by a product or business? Often I talk to developers who have no control over how something looks or behaves because it was signed off on before it even came to them. So that's a problem. If you can talk to users, awesome. If you can't, here's a few things you can sort of triangulate to get some information about what users might need. What do they need to do primarily? Those are the things you can start on. What are the primary features of your application? If you can do a little bit of research in the demographics of the people that use your application, you can start to figure out what types of disabilities are they more likely to have, based on their age, based on their location, based on their professions, things like that. What operating systems and browsers are they using? You can get some information about that and then make some decisions about, some educated guesses about what types of assistive technologies they're using. You can take this information and sort of create, not necessarily personas, but you can get a general sense of the types of users who are actually using your applications who might have disabilities. The last thing I want to talk about is building a community of practice, and this is the most important part. I'm not talking about like a workforce or a task force, because those are always top-down and don't work. This is about you going and talking to your coworkers, like, next week. So set up a meeting, see who shows up. That's the first step. See who's interested. Do a really simple activity together. Go through your website homepage with a keyboard, something really simple, and then go from there. What you can start to do is design community-wide experiments using all of the things you have at your disposal now that you have multiple people involved. Create manageable goals. You can experiment and just document and just keep going forever and ever and ever. You can also apply this to not accessibility, any sort of organization-wide initiative. So I'm out of time. Thank you.